The moment the captain walked out of the cockpit and left the plane sitting silent at the gate, 176 passengers stopped breathing. But that part of the story came later. Right now, inside the quiet luxury of first class on Atlantic Air Flight 712, the problem had just begun. The cabin lights glowed warm and soft, reflecting off polished chrome and wide leather seats. Outside the oval windows, the New York evening pressed dark against the glass. Ground crews moved under the floodlights like silent shadows. Engines hummed low, patient and powerful, waiting. Seat 1. A belonged to Richard Coleman, 50 years old, tall, silver hair cut sharp around the temples, a navy suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His cufflinks caught the overhead light every time he lifted his glass. He held a tumbler of 12-year scotch like it was part of his identity. Across the aisle, a younger man in a hoodie glanced over, then quickly looked away. Even strangers could feel the temperature around Richard Coleman, a kind of invisible pressure, the quiet gravity of money and authority. Richard liked that. He leaned back, stretching his long legs halfway into the aisle. The leather seat sighed under his weight. To Richard, this wasn't just another flight across the Atlantic. It was a victory lap. In less than 12 hours, he would land in London and finalize the acquisition of Northbridge Logistics. A deal worth billions. The kind of deal that made headlines on Wall Street. The kind of deal that turned powerful men into untouchable ones. He had spent the last 48 hours inside glass boardrooms in Midtown Manhattan, breaking weaker executives one by one until they signed. Now he was done. Now he would enjoy the reward. 15 hours of quiet sky, a flatbed seat, another scotch, and the deep, satisfying silence of knowing he had won. A flight attendant approached from the galley. Emily Carter, late 30s, sharp posture, calm eyes that had seen everything the skies could throw at her. "Good evening, Mr. Coleman," she said gently. Her voice had the polished calm of someone who had dealt with angry passengers, nervous flyers, and too many late-night arguments at 30,000 feet. "Can I bring you anything else before departure?" Richard didn't look up immediately. He took a slow sip, letting the ice clink against the glass. A deliberate pause. A small power move he had perfected over decades. "Another scotch," he said. Emily nodded. "Of course." She turned to leave, then hesitated. Her eyes moved briefly to the empty seat beside him. Seat 1. B. Still unoccupied. Richard followed her gaze and smiled faintly. He hated neighbors. He had called the airline concierge desk 3 times that afternoon, trying to block the seat. The young woman on the phone had sounded nervous. "I'm sorry, Mr. Coleman," she had said. "We can't guarantee an empty seat unless you purchase it." Richard had refused, out of principle. The world, in his opinion, already owed him space. Emily returned with the drink, just as another passenger stepped into the aisle. Tall, broad shoulders, mid-40s. He wore a charcoal blazer over a white t-shirt. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive, just clean, simple clothes that fit well. In one hand, he carried a worn leather satchel that looked like it had crossed more than a few continents. The man paused beside seat 1A. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was deep, calm, polite. Richard didn't move. He took another slow sip. The man waited. "I believe my seat is there," the man continued, gesturing toward the window seat. "Seat 1B. Richard finally turned his head. His eyes scanned the man from shoes to shoulders. Not crocodile leather, not Italian tailoring, no Rolex. Just sensible black Oxfords and a simple canvas strap watch. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "You're in my way," he said flatly. The man gave a small, patient smile. "To get to my seat," he said, "I'll need you to move your legs." Richard didn't move. Instead, he leaned back further, stretching them even more across the aisle. "Check your ticket again," Richard said. His voice had lost its politeness. "Economy is back there. Past the curtain." A few passengers nearby looked up. The man remained still. He didn't argue. He simply held out his boarding pass. The name printed across the top read, Dr. Marcus Bennett. "I know where economy is," Marcus said quietly. "I've flown it many times." Emily returned at that exact moment, holding Richard's drink. She sensed the tension instantly. The air around seat 1A had shifted. Tighter. Sharper. "Is there a problem?" she asked carefully. Richard didn't even look at her. "Yes," he said. "There's been a mistake." Emily turned to Marcus. "May I see your boarding pass, sir?" He handed it to her. She scanned it quickly. Her expression softened. "Dr. Bennett, welcome aboard," she said. "You're in seat 1B." The confirmation hung in the air. Marcus nodded politely. "Thank you." He stepped slightly closer to the aisle, still waiting for Richard to move. Richard set his glass down harder than necessary. The sound of glass against metal cut through the cabin. "I paid $12,000 for this seat," he said. His voice was louder now. Heads turned. Passengers in rows 2 and 3 leaned subtly forward. The young man in the hoodie pulled one earbud out. "I paid for comfort," Richard continued. "I paid for exclusivity." Marcus met his gaze calmly. "And I paid for a ticket to London," he replied. "If you move your legs, I'll be out of your way." Richard's face flushed slightly. "I'm not moving." The cabin grew quieter. Even the engine hum seemed softer. Marcus watched him for a moment. There was no anger in his face. Only something else. Something almost like curiosity. Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Coleman," she said gently. "We'll be closing the doors shortly." Richard stood up abruptly. His chair slid back with a low scrape. He was tall, but Marcus was taller. Richard pointed a manicured finger toward Marcus's chest. "I am a Diamond Elite member with this airline," he said. "I know the Vice President of Operations personally." He leaned closer. "And I specifically requested an appropriate environment." Marcus raised one eyebrow. "Appropriate?" Richard's voice dropped to a whisper that carried further than any shout. "Yes," he said. "Appropriate." Then he said the sentence that would change everything. "I don't fly with black people." The words landed like a hammer. A woman in row 2 gasped softly. The young man with the hoodie slowly lowered his phone. Emily Carter went pale, and Dr. Marcus Bennett didn't blink. For a second, the entire first-class cabin stopped moving. The words hung in the air like smoke no one wanted to breathe. Emily Carter's fingers tightened around the silver tray she was holding. She had heard angry passengers before. Drunk arguments, political rants, even a fistfight once on a red-eye to Dallas. But this was different. This wasn't anger. This was something colder, something deliberate. Across the aisle, a grey-haired woman slowly lowered her champagne glass. Her diamond bracelet clinked softly against the armrest. 3 rows back, the man in the hoodie removed both earbuds now. His phone was already halfway raised, camera quietly recording. Richard Coleman didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did. Maybe he liked it. He folded his arms across his chest and looked Marcus Bennett directly in the eyes. "I said what I said," Richard added, his voice calm now, almost bored. "I don't share a cabin with people like you." The silence deepened. Marcus Bennett stood still in the aisle. 6'3", broad shoulders, hands relaxed at his sides. The worn leather satchel hung loosely from one shoulder. His face showed no anger, no humiliation. Just a long, quiet breath. Inside his mind, thoughts moved slowly and carefully, like chess pieces across a board. He had seen this before, in boardrooms, in hospital corridors, at charity galas where men with expensive watches shook his hand while quietly wondering how he had been invited. But rarely this openly, rarely this stupid. Marcus looked down briefly at Richard's legs, still stretched across the aisle. Then he looked back up. "Mr. Coleman," he said calmly, "I'm simply trying to get to my seat." Richard smirked. "That's not going to happen." Emily finally found her voice. "Sir," she said carefully, "Dr. Bennett has a valid ticket. We do need to finish boarding." Richard turned toward her slowly. It was the look he used in boardrooms when someone junior had just said something incredibly inconvenient. "Emily, is it?" he said. "Yes, sir." "Then let me make this simple for you." He gestured toward Marcus without even looking. "Remove him." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Emily blinked. "I'm sorry." "I paid for this seat," Richard said louder. "And I'm not spending 15 hours sitting shoulder to shoulder with someone who doesn't belong here." A man in seat 2C leaned toward his wife and whispered something under his breath. The young tech guy in the hoodie shifted slightly, angling his phone to capture both faces. Marcus watched all of this quietly. Emily swallowed. "Sir," she said carefully, "we cannot remove a passenger based on personal preference." Richard's smile faded. "This isn't a preference," he snapped. "It's a safety concern." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "A safety concern," he repeated softly. Richard nodded. "I don't know who he is. I don't know where he came from. I don't know what he's capable of." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "You're right," he said quietly. "You don't." The calmness in his voice made Richard's face redden further. "You think this is funny?" Richard said. "No," Marcus replied. "I think it's sad." The word landed harder than an insult. Emily stepped between them slightly. "Mr. Coleman," she said, voice tightening, "I'm going to need you to lower your voice." Richard laughed. It was a sharp, humorless sound. "You're giving me instructions now?" He stepped forward, towering over Emily. "I bring more revenue to this airline in a year than half the people on this plane combined." His finger pointed again toward Marcus. "And you're choosing him?" Marcus sighed quietly. "Not tired, just disappointed. You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Richard turned back to him immediately. "Oh, I'm making it hard?" "Yes." Marcus adjusted the strap of his satchel. "You could simply move your legs." The simplicity of the sentence made several passengers exchange glances. Richard stared at him. Then slowly he sat back down again. But his legs remained exactly where they were. "I'm not moving," he said. A quiet rustle moved through the cabin. Emily took a small step back. "Sir," she said, "if this continues, I'll need to involve the purser." "Call whoever you want," Richard snapped. Then he leaned forward again, lowering his voice. "But if this plane takes off with him sitting next to me, I promise you every person in management will hear about it tomorrow morning." Marcus looked around the cabin briefly. The old couple in row 2 now watched openly. The tech guy was definitely filming. 2 businessmen across the aisle whispered quietly. A story was forming in the room. Richard didn't see it, or refused to. Marcus finally set his satchel down gently on the floor beside the seat. He folded his hands loosely in front of him. "Emily," he said softly. She looked at him, grateful for the calm voice. "Yes, Doctor." "If it helps," Marcus said, "I'm not trying to cause trouble." Richard scoffed loudly. "That's exactly what you're doing." Marcus ignored him. "I simply need to get to London tonight," he continued. Emily nodded. "I understand." Marcus glanced once more at Richard's legs blocking the aisle. Then he looked back at Emily. "Would you mind calling the captain?" The request surprised her. Passengers rarely asked for that directly. "Of course," she said. Richard laughed again. "Oh, this should be good." Emily turned quickly and moved toward the cockpit. The cabin door was already closed. Through the small glass window, the soft glow of instrument panels flickered inside. Richard leaned closer to Marcus. "You just made a big mistake," he said quietly. Marcus met his gaze without blinking. "No," he said. "I think you did." "3 rows back," the tech guy whispered under his breath while adjusting his phone. "This is about to explode." And somewhere deep in the cockpit, Captain Daniel Walker was already unbuckling his harness. Captain Daniel Walker stepped out of the cockpit with the slow, measured stride of a man who had spent 30 years walking into problems at 30,000 feet. He was 57, broad shoulders, steel grey hair cut short above a weathered face. The 4 gold stripes on his sleeves caught the cabin lights as he moved down the aisle. Passengers noticed him immediately. Something about the way a captain walks through his own aircraft changes the atmosphere. Conversations stop, eyes follow. Walker didn't rush. He never rushed. Emily Carter met him halfway down the aisle. Her voice dropped low as she explained. "Richard Coleman. Seat 1A. Refusing to move. Racist remarks. Blocking access to seat 1. B." Walker listened without interrupting. Not once. When she finished, he gave a single nod. "Thank you, Emily." Then he continued forward. Richard Coleman saw him coming and immediately straightened his jacket. His confidence returned like a switch flipping back on. "Finally," Authority had arrived. "Captain," Richard said, as Walker approached, his voice suddenly smooth and controlled again. "Glad you're here. Your staff is having difficulty understanding a simple request." Walker stopped directly in front of him. He didn't look at Marcus Bennett first. He looked at Richard. Really looked. The expensive suit, the gold watch, the glass of scotch resting on the console, the legs still blocking the aisle like a barricade. Walker had flown combat missions in the Gulf. He had handled engine failures over the Atlantic and once landed a fully loaded jet with smoke filling the cockpit. This man didn't intimidate him. "I heard what you requested," Walker said quietly. His voice was low, but carried through the cabin like a steady engine hum. Richard smiled. "Good," he said. "Then you understand." Walker turned his head slightly. For the first time, he looked at Marcus Bennett. Marcus stood calmly beside seat 1A, hands resting loosely together, posture straight, expression unreadable. Their eyes met. A silent exchange. Walker nodded once. Then he looked back at Richard. "Dr. Bennett," Walker said over his shoulder, "I apologize for the delay." Marcus gave a small, polite nod. "Not a problem, Captain." Richard frowned. "Wait," he said. "Hold on." Walker continued speaking as if Richard had not interrupted. "Sir, you are absolutely entitled to your assigned seat." Marcus simply said, "Thank you." Richard's voice rose sharply. "Excuse me." Walker turned slowly. Now his full attention returned to Richard Coleman. "Mr. Coleman," he said evenly, "my crew informs me you have refused to allow another passenger to access his seat." Richard lifted his chin. "That's correct. And my crew also informs me," Walker continued, "that you used discriminatory language toward that passenger." Richard shrugged. "I expressed a preference." The words landed with oily confidence. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. Walker watched him for a long moment. "On my aircraft," Walker said slowly, "the only thing that matters is safety and respect." Richard leaned forward. "And on my ticket," he snapped, "the only thing that matters is that I paid $12,000. A murmur moved through the cabin. The tech guy in the hoodie angled his phone slightly closer. Walker's eyes did not move from Richard. "You paid for transportation to London," he said. "You did not purchase control of the cabin." Richard laughed. "Oh, come on, Captain. Let's not pretend this is complicated. Just move him somewhere else." Walker did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced once more at Marcus. Marcus remained silent, calm, patient, almost curious. Walker returned his gaze to Richard. "Move your legs," the captain said. The simplicity of the sentence hung in the air. Richard blinked. "I'm sorry?" Walker repeated himself. "Move your legs so the passenger can reach his seat." Richard's face flushed. "That's not happening." Walker nodded slowly. "Then we have a problem." Richard leaned back with exaggerated relaxation. "No," he said. "You have a problem." He tapped the armrest with one manicured finger. "I know the vice president of operations for this airline." "Personally." The sentence landed like a threat. Walker showed no reaction. "I'm sure you do." Richard leaned closer. And I promise you this flight crew will be having a very unpleasant meeting with corporate tomorrow if you let this continue." Walker folded his hands behind his back, the posture of a man completely comfortable with confrontation. "Mr. Coleman," he said quietly, "I've been flying airplanes longer than most executives have been sitting in offices." Richard opened his mouth to interrupt, but Walker raised a hand. "Not aggressive, just final. Let me finish." The cabin had gone completely silent now. Even the low rumble of the engines seemed distant. "You have two options," Walker continued. "You can move your legs and allow Dr. Bennett to take his seat." Richard stared at him. "And the second option?" he asked coldly. Walker's voice remained calm. "The second option is that you leave this aircraft." A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. Richard's eyebrows shot up. "You're joking." Walker did not smile. "I rarely joke about safety." Richard leaned forward suddenly, his voice rising. "This is insane. You're threatening to remove a paying customer because of a misunderstanding?" Walker tilted his head slightly. There was no misunderstanding. The words were sharp now. Direct. Richard's face turned red. "You can't do that," he snapped. Walker studied him. "I can," he said. Richard laughed again, louder this time. "Go ahead. Try." For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other. One rich, one in command. Then Walker did something unexpected. He reached up slowly and removed his captain's hat. Several passengers exchanged confused looks. Walker tucked the hat under his arm. Then he stepped sideways toward the cockpit door. He reached inside and grabbed his black flight bag. Richard frowned. "What are you doing?" Walker turned back to face the cabin. "I am the pilot in command of this aircraft." Richard waved dismissively. Yes, we all know that." Walker continued as if he had not spoken. "And as pilot in command, I have the authority to determine whether conditions are safe for departure." Richard rolled his eyes. "This is ridiculous." Walker looked him directly in the eyes. "With the hostility currently present in this cabin," the captain said calmly, "I do not believe this flight can be conducted safely." A few passengers gasped softly. Richard blinked. "Then remove him," he said, pointing angrily at Marcus. Walker's answer came immediately. "No." Richard's confusion deepened. "Then what exactly are you saying?" Walker lifted his flight bag. "I'm saying I'm not flying." The sentence hit the cabin like a sudden drop in altitude. Richard stared. "What?" Walker raised his voice slightly so the entire cabin could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is Captain Daniel Walker." Passengers leaned forward. "I regret to inform you that I am removing myself from duty." The words echoed through the aircraft. "I will not pilot an aircraft where a passenger is being verbally abused because of the color of his skin." The silence that followed felt enormous. Richard's mouth opened. "You can't do that." Walker looked at him. "My contract is to operate a safe aircraft." He gestured calmly toward Richard. "You have created an unsafe environment." Richard's voice cracked with anger. "This is insane!" Walker shrugged lightly. "If he doesn't fly," he said, nodding toward Marcus, "then I don't fly." Then he turned and started walking down the aisle. Passengers watched in stunned silence. Richard's voice followed him. "Where are you going?" Walker didn't stop. "Coffee," he said over his shoulder. Then he added one final sentence. "Let me know when the racist gets off my plane." For a moment after the captain disappeared through the cabin door, no one moved. The aircraft sat silent at the gate, engines humming quietly, lights steady, a giant machine waiting for a human decision that suddenly no longer existed. Richard Coleman stood frozen in the aisle. His mouth was still open. It took several seconds before the reality began creeping in. He spun around slowly, looking from one passenger to another, expecting someone to laugh, someone to step in, someone with authority, to restore the order he was used to. No one did. The silence changed shape. It stopped being tense. It became judgment. Then, somewhere from the back of the plane, a single pair of hands started clapping. Slow, measured. One clap, then another. Heads turned. The sound traveled forward through economy, like a wave pushing through rows of seats. A man in business class joined in, then a woman 2 rows behind first class. Then someone else. Within seconds, the applause spread through the entire cabin. It rolled forward like thunder. Passengers leaned into the aisle, clapping openly now. The young tech guy in the hoodie stood halfway out of his seat, recording with one hand while applauding with the other. The grey-haired woman with the diamond bracelet nodded firmly as she clapped. Emily Carter stood near the galley, stunned. Richard Coleman did not understand what he was seeing. "Stop it!" he barked suddenly. His voice cracked. The applause only grew louder. "You people are insane!" he shouted. The sound of 176 passengers clapping together filled the aircraft. Richard turned in a circle, rage building in his chest. He pointed toward Marcus Bennett. "This is his fault!" Marcus was no longer standing. He had calmly stepped aside and now sat quietly in seat 1B. He had taken out a slim tablet from his satchel and was scrolling through something that looked suspiciously like a medical journal. Unbothered. Untouched. Richard stared at him. "Say something," Richard snapped. Marcus looked up slowly. His face remained calm. "The captain already said everything necessary," he replied quietly. Richard's face turned purple. "You think you won something here?" Marcus simply removed his glasses and folded them neatly. "I believe," he said softly, "you're blocking the aisle again." As if summoned by the tension itself, the heavy thud of boots sounded from the jet bridge. 3 uniformed officers from the Port Authority Police Department stepped onto the plane. The lead officer was a tall man with a buzz cut and a square jaw that had clearly seen years of airport chaos. Sergeant Daniel Miller. His eyes scanned the cabin once. He saw the phones, the angry passengers, the red-faced man standing in the aisle. He walked forward slowly, each step deliberate. Emily Carter pointed quietly toward Richard. "That's him." Miller stopped directly in front of Richard. "Sir," he said evenly, "grab your belongings." Richard blinked. "You're coming with us." Richard laughed in disbelief. "I'm the victim here," he said loudly. Several passengers groaned. "This pilot abandoned the aircraft," Richard continued, pointing wildly toward Marcus. "And this man provoked the situation." Miller did not blink. "The pilot stepped down because you created a hostile environment," he replied calmly. Richard stepped closer. "You have no idea who I am." Miller shrugged slightly. "I hear that about 10 times a day." Richard jabbed a finger toward the cabin. "This is ridiculous. I paid for this seat. I refuse to leave. Miller's hand rested casually on his belt. Sir, the airline has revoked your ticket. Richard's confidence flickered for the first time. You can't do that. Yes, Miller said simply. We can. The cabin watched silently. Phones still recording. Miller continued. You are now trespassing on a federally regulated aircraft. He nodded toward the aisle. You have two choices. Richard's breathing grew louder. Walk off the plane. The officer paused. Or get dragged off. A man across the aisle muttered under his breath. Please pick dragged. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the cabin. Richard heard it. His pride cracked. He turned and yanked his leather briefcase from the overhead bin so hard the compartment slammed shut behind him. Fine, he snapped. I don't want to fly on this garbage airline anyway. He shoved past the officers toward the exit. Passengers leaned away as he stormed down the aisle. Phones followed his every step. Just before reaching the door, he stopped. Marcus Bennett sat quietly beside seat 1A. Richard leaned down close to him, their faces inches apart. You think this is over? Richard whispered. Marcus met his gaze without emotion. Richard continued. I have resources you can't imagine. His voice dropped lower. I will find out where you work. Marcus said nothing. By Monday morning, Richard finished. You'll be unemployed. Marcus held his eyes for a long moment. Then he spoke calmly. Safe travels, Mr. Coleman. Richard's jaw clenched. He stormed out onto the jet bridge. The moment he disappeared through the door, the entire plane erupted. Cheers, laughter, applause louder than before. Emily Carter leaned against the galley wall, exhaling slowly. The young tech guy pumped his fist in the air. This is going viral, he said. Marcus quietly returned to his tablet, as if nothing had happened. Several minutes later, the first officer stepped out of the cockpit. Timothy Harris, early 40s, nervous energy in his shoulders. He picked up the cabin intercom. His voice echoed through the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Harris speaking. The cabin quieted. As you witnessed, Captain Walker has removed himself from duty. He paused. Under federal aviation law, a commercial aircraft cannot depart without a pilot in command. Passengers exchanged glances. Therefore, Harris continued, this flight is currently delayed until further notice. A collective groan moved through the plane. But it wasn't directed at the crew. Every eye turned toward the empty doorway Richard had just passed through. 3 rows back, the tech guy lifted his phone. 40,000 views already, he whispered. Up the jet bridge, Richard Coleman had no idea that his life had just changed forever. Richard Coleman stepped off the jet bridge and into the fluorescent glare of the terminal, like a man walking out of a courtroom he believed he had just won. His shoulders were straight, his jaw tight, the expensive leather briefcase still clenched in his hand like a weapon. Behind him, the 3 Port Authority officers followed at a measured pace, making sure he kept moving. Passengers waiting near the gate turned their heads. People always look when police walk someone through an airport. Some stared openly. Others whispered. A child pointed. Richard pretended not to notice any of it. He adjusted his tie, smoothing the silk like armor. You're making a serious mistake, he said over his shoulder to Sergeant Miller. The officer didn't break stride. "Sir, keep walking." "I'm telling you right now," Richard continued, voice rising, "I know people in this airline who will have your badge by tomorrow morning." Miller sighed quietly. "Yeah," he said. "I get fired about 5 times a day by guys in suits." They turned down a corridor toward the airport police office. The noise of the terminal softened behind the thick doors. Inside the small holding area, the air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and disinfectant. Richard was not thrown into a cell. He wasn't handcuffed, either. Instead, they sat him in a metal chair beside a plain desk, where a young officer began typing up paperwork. "Name?" the officer asked. Richard exhaled sharply. "Richard Coleman. Address?" He gave it. "Park Avenue, Upper East Side." The officer typed. "Occupation?" Richard paused. "Senior partner," he said. The officer looked up briefly. "At?" "Coleman and Pierce Capital." The name usually changed the tone of a conversation. Usually people straightened when they heard it. Usually they realized they were speaking to someone important. This officer just kept typing. After 20 minutes, Richard was issued a citation. Disorderly conduct, interference with flight crew operations. Sergeant Miller handed him the paperwork. "You're free to go," he said. Richard stood slowly. "You'll be hearing from my attorney," he said. Miller nodded. "I look forward to it." Outside the police office, the terminal was louder now. Evening traffic, rolling luggage, boarding announcements echoing across the ceilings. Richard took a deep breath. He needed control again. He needed to get to London. His lawyer was already waiting near the exit. Benedict Shaw, mid-40s, thin face, perfectly pressed suit, the kind of attorney who always looked like he had just stepped out of a boardroom. "What the hell happened?" Benedict asked as Richard approached. "An incompetent pilot and a race-baiting passenger," Richard snapped. Benedict frowned. "I've already had 3 reporters call my office." Richard stopped walking. "What?" Benedict held up his phone. "Something went viral." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" Benedict didn't answer. Instead, he turned the screen toward him. A video filled the display, shot from a seat a few rows away. The angle was steady. The audio was crystal clear. Richard watched himself on screen. Red-faced, pointing, shouting. "I don't fly with black people." The words came from his own mouth, loud, ugly, unfiltered. The camera shifted to Marcus Bennett, sitting calmly beside him. Then Captain Walker removing his hat. Then the applause. Richard's stomach dropped. "How many views?" he asked. Benedict swallowed. 4.5 million. Richard stared at the screen. He could hear himself again. "I don't fly with black people." The video looped. Underneath, thousands of comments raced down the screen. "Find this guy. Fire him. Boycott his company." Someone had already identified him. Usernames flashed. "That's Richard Coleman from Coleman and Pierce. My cousin used to work there. Guy's a nightmare. Cancel them." Richard felt sweat slide down his back. "Take it down," he said. Benedict shook his head. "It's everywhere." Richard grabbed the phone. "File a takedown notice. Copyright. Defamation. I don't care what it takes." Benedict looked at him carefully. "You're clearly visible, Richard." Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. Once, then again, then continuously. He pulled it out. 42 missed calls. Dozens of text messages. His email inbox was refreshing so fast, the screen looked like a slot machine. "What is happening?" Richard whispered. He opened a message from his daughter, Emily. They rarely spoke unless she needed money. The text was simple. "Dad, please tell me this isn't you." Below it was the same video. Richard felt the floor shift slightly under his feet. Then his phone rang again. This time the caller ID froze him completely. Roger Henderson, chairman of Coleman and Pierce, his boss, the man who had approved the Northbridge logistics deal. Richard answered immediately. "Roger, listen," he said quickly. "This is being blown completely out of context." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Roger spoke. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. "Shut up, Richard." The words cut clean. Richard stopped breathing. "I watched the video," Roger continued. "My wife watched the video. Everyone on the board has watched the video." Richard forced a laugh. "It's edited. Social media does that." The passenger was aggressive. "Stop!" Roger's voice hardened. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Richard straightened. "I defended my space. You destroyed a billion-dollar acquisition," Roger replied. Richard blinked. "What?" "The Northbridge deal is dead." Richard laughed nervously. "That's impossible." "We have the financing. I'm flying to London to sign tomorrow." "No," Roger said. "You're not." Richard's throat tightened. "Check your email." His hands shook as he opened the inbox again. At the very top sat a new message. Sender: Bennett Global Holdings. Subject line: Immediate termination of negotiations. Richard opened it slowly. The words blurred together for a moment before sharpening into focus. Due to the recent incident involving Mr. Richard Coleman on Atlantic Air. Flight 712. Bennett Global Holdings is formally withdrawing from all merger discussions with Coleman and Pierce Capital. Richard frowned. "Who the hell is Bennett Global?" he asked into the phone. Roger's voice came back heavy with disbelief. "Richard, did you even research the parent company of Northbridge Logistics?" "I looked at the financials," Richard said defensively. "The chairman of Bennett Global," Roger continued slowly, "is Sir Marcus Bennett." Richard stopped breathing. The name echoed in his head. Marcus Bennett. Seat 1B, the man he had just threatened. Roger spoke again. "He's one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in Europe, and the majority owner of the company you were trying to buy." Richard's mind replayed the moment on the plane. The calm voice, the patient smile, the boarding pass. Dr. Marcus Bennett. And suddenly Richard Coleman understood exactly who he had just tried to throw out of first class. Richard Coleman didn't speak for several seconds. The noise of the terminal faded into a dull blur behind the phone pressed against his ear. Passengers rolled suitcases past him. A gate announcement echoed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a child was laughing. None of it felt real. "You're telling me," Richard said slowly, "that the man on the plane—" "Yes," Roger Henderson interrupted coldly. "That man." Richard's throat went dry. "Sir Marcus Bennett." The words landed like a hammer. Roger continued. "He owns Bennett Global Holdings." Richard's eyes moved without focus across the busy terminal. People walking, screens flashing flight numbers, travelers sipping coffee. His world was collapsing in the middle of it. "He's the majority shareholder of the Northbridge Logistics," Roger said. "The company you were supposed to acquire tomorrow." Richard shook his head. "That's impossible." Roger let out a short breath. "Richard, he was flying to London tonight for a surgery." The memory of the man standing calmly in the aisle came rushing back. Simple clothes, a worn leather satchel, a quiet voice. "I have surgery scheduled in London tomorrow morning." Richard felt cold. "He's a surgeon?" Richard whispered. "One of the most respected cardiac surgeons in Europe," Roger replied. "Knighted 3 years ago." Richard leaned against a nearby pillar. His legs suddenly felt weak. "He donates half his income to global medical programs," Roger continued. "He flies commercial because he gives most of his travel stipend to charity." Richard's mind replayed the scene again. The seat, the quiet patience, the insult, "I don't fly with black people." Roger spoke again, voice sharp now. "And you arrogant idiot, you tried to throw him out of his own seat." Richard's chest tightened. "I didn't know who he was," he said weakly. "That's exactly the problem." The words hit harder than anything else. Roger didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Did you never once check the leadership page of the company we were buying?" Roger asked. Richard said nothing. "I looked at the numbers," Richard muttered finally. "The numbers." Roger laughed once. It wasn't humor. It was disgust. "The numbers are gone now." Richard gripped the phone tighter. "I can fix this," he said quickly. "Let me get to London. I'll apologize. I'll explain." Roger's voice turned to ice. "There is no London meeting." "What?" "The board of Bennett Global cancelled the acquisition this morning." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. "They sent a formal statement," Roger continued. "They will not do business with a firm represented by someone who behaves like that." Richard's head spun. "That deal was worth billions," he whispered. "Yes," Roger said quietly, "and now it's worth nothing." The silence stretched. Passengers continued flowing around Richard like water around a rock. "I can still repair this," Richard insisted. "I'll personally meet with Bennett. I'll apologize." Roger didn't answer immediately. Then he said the words Richard would never forget. "You're fired." Richard blinked. "What?" "You're done, Richard." "You can't fire me," Richard said sharply. "I have equity in the firm. Read your contract." Roger's voice carried no emotion. "The morality clause." Richard felt the ground tilt again. Roger continued. "Gross misconduct that brings public disrepute to the firm." Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "We're issuing a statement in 10 minutes distancing the company from you," Roger said. "Your office access has been revoked. Security has been notified." Richard's heart pounded. "Roger, wait." The line went dead. Richard lowered the phone slowly. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Benedict Shaw watched him carefully. "Well?" the lawyer asked. Richard swallowed. "The deal's dead." Benedict's eyes widened. "And?" Richard's voice sounded hollow. "I'm fired." The lawyer looked down at his watch. "Then we have another problem." Richard stared at him. "What?" "My retainer agreement," Benedict said calmly, "is with Coleman and Pierce Capital." Richard felt irritation flash through him. "Benedict, Not now. I'm serious, Benedict continued. If you've been terminated for cause, the firm is no longer responsible for my billable hours. Richard blinked. You're kidding. Benedict shook his head. If you want me to represent you personally moving forward, I'll need a $50,000 retainer. The words landed like another punch. Richard stared at the man who had been his lawyer for 8 years. You're dropping me. I'm protecting my firm, Benedict replied. Richard looked around the terminal again. The crowds, the lights, the constant motion of people who had no idea that his life had just detonated. His phone buzzed again. Another email, another message, another notification. Richard opened one. A news headline. Wall Street executive caught in racist airline meltdown. Another. Coleman and Pierce partner removed from flight after racial slur. Another. Video passes 6 million views. Richard's stomach twisted. I'll sue them all, he muttered. Who? Benedict asked. The airline. Bennett, everyone. Benedict shook his head slowly. You're not in a strong legal position right now. Richard's anger surged. He set me up. Benedict raised an eyebrow. How? He knew who I was. Benedict studied him. Richard. He was sitting in his assigned seat. Richard opened his mouth again. Nothing came out. The lawyer slipped his phone into his pocket. If you decide you want representation, Benedict said calmly, call my office with the retainer. Then he walked away into the crowd. Richard stood alone. Completely alone. For the first time in 30 years. He turned toward the glass exit doors leading outside. He needed air. He needed a drink. He pushed through the doors into the cool New York night. Flashes exploded in his face immediately. White light, camera shutters, voices shouting. Mr. Coleman, is it true you made racist remarks on the plane? Have you been fired? Microphones pushed toward him. Television cameras rolled. A reporter from CNN stepped forward. Mr. Coleman, why did you attack Dr. Marcus Bennett? Richard raised a hand to block the lights. Get away from me, he snapped. But the reporters pressed closer. Do you regret what you said? Did you know Dr. Bennett owns the company you were trying to buy? The question froze him. Richard lowered his hand slowly. How did you... Sir, the video is everywhere, the reporter said. Richard looked around. Cameras, lights, phones recording. The entire world watching. And somewhere far above the Atlantic Ocean, Dr. Marcus Bennett was quietly preparing to save someone's life, while Richard Coleman's life was coming apart piece by piece on the ground. The next morning, Richard Coleman woke up in his penthouse on Park Avenue, believing the storm would pass. He had survived worse in business. Markets crashed. Deals collapsed. Competitors attacked. None of it had ever destroyed him. This, he told himself, would be the same. The city outside his windows was waking slowly under grey winter clouds. Traffic murmured along the avenue. Somewhere below, a taxi honked impatiently. Richard stood at the kitchen counter in a silk robe, staring at his phone. Notifications were still pouring in. Hundreds, thousands. He opened a news app. His own face filled the screen. Frozen mid-shout, eyes wild, finger pointing. Headline, Wall Street executives' racist outburst sparks global backlash. Richard closed the app quickly. Another headline replaced it. Northbridge acquisition collapses after airline incident. He set the phone down. This will blow over, he muttered. He poured himself coffee with hands that weren't entirely steady. Scandals burned hot for a few days. Then the world found something else to scream about. Someone would say something worse. A politician would get caught cheating. The internet would move on. Richard clung to that idea. At 9 in the morning, the doorman called upstairs. "Mr. Coleman, there's a gentleman here with documents." Richard sighed. "Send him up." 5 minutes later, the elevator opened, and a thin man in a dark coat stepped out, holding a thick envelope. Process server. Richard knew the look instantly. The man handed him the documents without emotion. "You've been served." Richard opened the envelope casually, then stopped breathing. Divorce papers, filed by Catherine Coleman, his wife of 20 years. He grabbed his phone immediately and called her. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Catherine, what is this?" Her voice was calm, colder than he had ever heard it. "It's a divorce, Richard. You're overreacting." "No," she replied. "I'm reacting exactly the way everyone else is." Richard paced across the living room. "You're leaving me because of a stupid video?" Catherine said quietly, "I'm leaving because the man in that video is the man you've always been." The words hit harder than the divorce itself. Richard stopped pacing. "You've never complained before." "I ignored it," she said. "The arrogance, the way you treat people." Richard ran a hand through his hair. "You married me?" "Yes," she replied. "Because the checks cleared." The silence stretched. "I'm in Paris," she continued, "and I won't be coming back." Richard felt anger surge. "You can't just walk away from this." "Oh, I can," she said. "And since the morality clause in our prenup applies to public acts of moral misconduct." Her voice softened slightly. "I'll be doing just fine." The call ended. Richard stood motionless in the middle of the penthouse. His phone buzzed again. Another delivery. This time a courier from his own firm. He opened the package slowly. A formal letter from the board of directors. Effective immediately, the firm formerly known as Coleman and Pierce Capital will be rebranding as Vertex Capital. Richard laughed once. A short, empty sound. "They can't do that." He kept reading. The board was also filing a civil lawsuit against him. $50 million in damages for reputational harm and the collapse of the Northbridge acquisition. Richard dropped the papers onto the marble counter. "They're suing me?" He looked around the apartment as if someone might answer. "I built that company." He grabbed his coat. He would go to the office. He would fix this. An hour later, he stepped out of the building onto Park Avenue. The cold winter air hit his face. For the first time in years, there was no car waiting, no driver holding the door open. Instead, a small group of people stood on the sidewalk. College students, holding signs. One of them recognized him immediately. "That's him." Richard froze. Before he could react, a splash of red paint struck his chest. The liquid spread across his expensive coat like blood. "Racist!" someone shouted. The group began chanting. Cameras appeared instantly, phones recording. Richard stared down at the paint, soaking into his clothing. Then he turned toward the building entrance. "Henry!" he shouted. The doorman stood behind the glass door. For 10 years, Richard had walked past him without learning his last name. Now Henry looked at him quietly. "I need you to get them away from me," Richard demanded. Henry hesitated. Then he slowly shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir." Richard blinked. "What?" "The building board voted this morning," Henry said through the glass. "Your residence is being foreclosed." Richard's mouth fell open. "You're joking." Henry shook his head again. "Bank foreclosure started at 9 o'clock. Richard stepped closer to the glass. "I own this penthouse." "Not anymore," Henry said softly. Behind him, the protesters continued shouting. Cameras flashing. Richard turned back toward the street. Red paint dripped from his coat. For the first time in his life, he stood in the middle of New York City with nowhere to go. A black woman walking past paused when she saw his dropped credit card on the sidewalk. She looked at it, then looked at him, and kept walking. Richard Coleman had spent his life believing certain people were beneath him. Now he was invisible to everyone. 3 months later, the penthouse was gone. 6 months later, the lawsuits were still climbing, and Richard Coleman was living in a tiny studio apartment in Queens, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a single moment on an airplane had burned his entire life to the ground. 6 months later, Richard Coleman sat alone in a small studio apartment in Queens, staring at a plastic cup of instant noodles that had gone cold. The room smelled faintly of damp carpet and cheap cleaning chemicals. The radiator under the window hissed like an old snake trying to breathe. Outside, traffic groaned along Roosevelt Avenue while winter wind rattled the thin glass. Richard looked 20 years older. His hair had thinned. The sharp lines of his expensive suits had been replaced by a wrinkled sweatshirt and grey sweatpants bought from a discount store down the street. The television flickered in the corner of the room, but he wasn't really watching it. He had spent the past 6 months fighting. Lawyers, appeals, statements, attempts to bury the video. Nothing worked. The lawsuits came one after another. The airline sued him for the cost of the cancelled flight and passenger compensation. $200,000 he didn't have. His former company sued him for damages. The bank repossessed the penthouse. The divorce drained what remained. He had sold the watch, the cufflinks, the car. All that remained was a few boxes of clothes and a name that had become a joke on the internet. Richard lifted the noodles and forced down a few bites. The broth tasted like salt and cardboard. His chest had been hurting for weeks now. A heavy pressure under the breastbone that came and went. He ignored it. Doctors were expensive. He leaned back in the folding chair and stared at the television again. The local news anchor spoke brightly. And in a historic moment for New York healthcare, the new cardiac wing at St. Jude Medical Center opened today. Richard barely listened. He slurped another mouthful of noodles. The anchor continued. The facility was funded entirely through a donation from the Bennett Global Foundation. Richard froze. The fork stopped halfway to his mouth. On the television screen, a ribbon-cutting ceremony appeared. Crowds of doctors and reporters gathered around the entrance of a gleaming glass hospital wing. Standing at the center was a tall man in a white coat. Calm. Composed. Marcus Bennett. Richard felt heat rush through his face. Marcus spoke into a microphone. "We believe healthcare is a human right," he said. His voice was smooth and steady. "That every heart deserves the chance to keep beating." Applause followed. The mayor of New York stood beside him, smiling. Richard dropped the plastic fork. The noodles spilled across the floor. "That should have been my money," Richard muttered. His voice grew louder. "That was my deal." The anger rose quickly, hot and irrational. "My deal." The pain in his chest flared suddenly, sharp, violent. It felt like something heavy had dropped directly onto his rib cage. Richard gasped. The room spun slightly. He clutched his chest with one hand. The pain spread down his left arm. A deep, crushing pressure that stole the air from his lungs. "Damn it!" he wheezed. He tried to stand. His legs gave out. He collapsed onto the linoleum floor beside the spilled noodles. The television kept playing. Marcus Bennett continued speaking calmly to reporters. Richard's vision blurred. His phone lay on the table across the room. He crawled toward it slowly, dragging himself across the cold floor. Each movement sent another spike of pain through his chest. By the time he reached the table, his breathing had become shallow and uneven. He grabbed the phone with trembling fingers. 911. The operator answered. 911. "What is your emergency?" Richard struggled to speak. "My chest, sir. Are you alone?" "Yes." "Stay calm. Help is on the way." Richard slid down against the wall. His phone fell from his hand. The television light flickered across the room as darkness crept into the edges of his vision. The last thing he heard, before everything went black, was Marcus Bennett's voice on the news broadcast. "Every heart deserves the chance to keep beating." When Richard opened his eyes again, the ceiling above him was bright white. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Machines beeped around him in steady rhythm. He tried to move. Pain shot through his chest. "Easy," a voice said. Richard turned his head slightly. A young nurse stood beside the bed, checking a chart. Her name badge read, "Matteo." "You had a massive heart attack," the nurse said calmly. Richard's throat felt dry. "Where am I?" "St. Jude Medical Center," Matteo replied. Richard blinked slowly. The words settled over him like a cruel joke. "You flatlined in the ambulance," Matteo continued. "Paramedics shocked you twice." Richard swallowed. "So I died?" "Briefly," the nurse said. "But you're lucky." Matteo adjusted the IV line. "You're in the new cardiac wing. The best equipment in the city." Richard stared at the ceiling. The irony pressed down on him heavier than the heart attack itself. He was alive. Because of the hospital funded by the man he had humiliated on a plane. "I need a private room," Richard croaked. The old habits slipped out automatically. Matteo looked at him. Then he laughed softly. "Mr. Coleman, you're listed as indigent." Richard blinked. "No insurance. You're lucky you got a bed at all." Matteo finished adjusting the chart. "Try to rest." Richard closed his eyes slowly. Machines continued their steady beeping beside him. Each sound marking another second he had been given. Hours later, the hallway outside filled with quiet movement. Doctors speaking. Nurses straightening their uniforms. Richard opened his eyes again as footsteps approached. A group of physicians walked into the ward, conducting their afternoon rounds. At the center of them was a tall figure in a white coat. Richard's heart monitor began to beep faster. Marcus Bennett stopped at the foot of the bed and picked up the chart. He read the name slowly. Richard Coleman. The room fell silent. The hospital administrator beside him shifted uncomfortably. "Sir Marcus," the man whispered. "We can move on, if you prefer." Marcus raised a hand. He looked down at the man lying in the hospital bed. The once powerful executive now looked pale and thin under the hospital blanket. Richard tried to speak. No words came. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Mr. Coleman," he said calmly, "you had a blockage in the left anterior descending artery. The Widowmaker." Richard nodded weakly. Marcus continued reading the chart. "The stent used during your procedure is a polymer eluting model." Richard blinked. "My company developed the patent last year." Richard stared at him. The device keeping his heart beating had been created by the man he once refused to sit beside. "I," Richard whispered. Marcus looked at him quietly. The anger that once burned inside Richard was gone. Only shame remained. Marcus closed the chart gently. "I told you once," he said softly. "Anger is very bad for the heart." Marcus Bennett stood quietly at the foot of the hospital bed, the chart resting lightly in his hands. The ward had grown silent around them. Doctors who had followed him during rounds waited a few steps behind, unsure whether to continue walking or stay. Machines hummed steadily. The heart monitor beside Richard Coleman blinked green numbers into the dim afternoon light. Beep, beep, beep. Each sound carried weight now. Each one proof that Richard was still alive. Marcus studied him for a long moment. The man lying in the bed barely resembled the man who had blocked an airplane aisle months earlier. The arrogance had drained from his face. The expensive suit was gone. In its place was a hospital gown and the pale look of someone who had come close to disappearing. Richard's lips moved. He began. His voice cracked. Marcus waited. The room seemed to lean forward. Richard tried again. "I want to apologize." The words came slowly, as if his throat had forgotten how to form them. Marcus did not interrupt. "I was wrong," Richard whispered. His eyes filled with something unfamiliar. Not anger. Not pride. Something closer to shame. Marcus nodded once. He placed the chart back onto the metal hook at the end of the bed. Behind him, one of the younger residents shifted nervously. Everyone in the hospital had seen the video. Everyone knew the story. The powerful executive who destroyed his own life on a plane. Now the same man lay here alive, only because the doctor he insulted had built the technology keeping his heart beating. Richard looked at Marcus with fragile uncertainty. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. Marcus rested one hand lightly against the bed rail. "You're not the first person who has spoken to me that way," he said. His voice remained calm, measured. "But most of them never get the chance to see the consequences." Richard looked away. "I lost everything," he murmured. Marcus nodded slightly. "Yes," he said. "But you're still breathing." The heart monitor beeped again. Beep. Beep. Marcus glanced at the screen briefly before continuing. Most people never realize how fragile life actually is, he said. They spend decades believing they control everything. Richard swallowed. Marcus continued. Then one moment arrives, one decision, and the entire structure collapses. Richard closed his eyes. That moment was on the plane. Yes, Marcus replied, but not for the reason you think. Richard opened his eyes again. Marcus stepped slightly closer to the bed. That moment revealed something that had been there for a long time, he said. Richard didn't argue. He knew it was true. Marcus turned slightly toward the resident beside him. Continue monitoring his vitals every hour, he said. The young doctor nodded quickly. Yes, Dr. Bennett. Marcus turned to leave. Wait. Richard's voice was weak but urgent. Marcus stopped. He did not turn immediately. Richard struggled to lift his head slightly. Why? He asked. Marcus looked back over his shoulder. Richard's voice trembled. After everything I said, why help me? Marcus studied him quietly. The question hung in the air longer than expected. Finally, Marcus spoke. Because I took an oath. His tone was steady. To do no harm. Richard's eyes filled. Marcus continued. And unlike you, Mr. Coleman. He paused. I do not measure a person's value by the worst thing they have ever said. Richard stared at him. Marcus finished calmly. I measure it by whether their heart is still beating. The monitor beside the bed answered with another steady sound. Beep. Marcus gave a small nod toward the resident. Keep him on the beta blockers. Yes, doctor. Marcus walked away. His footsteps faded slowly down the hallway. Richard watched him go. The machines continued their quiet rhythm. The man he once called unworthy had just given him another chance to live. And for the first time in his life, Richard Coleman understood what real power looked like. 3 years later, John F. Kennedy International Airport was just as loud and crowded as it had always been. Suitcases rolled across polished floors. Announcements echoed through the terminals. Flights departed every few minutes carrying strangers across continents. Near Gate 42, a janitor pushed a yellow mop bucket slowly across the tiled floor of the men's restroom. The name tag on his uniform read, Rick. His back ached as he wrung out the mop. The medication he took each morning made him tired. But it was a job, and it paid just enough to keep the small Queen's apartment. Rick paused for a moment, stretching his stiff shoulders. 3 years earlier, he had walked through this airport, surrounded by cameras and police. Now most travelers walked past him without noticing he existed. A young businessman rushed into the restroom, speaking loudly into his phone. Yeah, upgrade me, the man said. I'm not sitting in the back with the cattle. Rick glanced at him briefly. The gold watch, the expensive suit, the impatience in the man's voice. It felt like looking into a mirror from another life. The businessman brushed past him, knocking the wet floor sign over. He didn't stop, didn't apologize. He simply continued washing his hands while finishing the call. Rick bent down slowly and set the sign upright again. Then he walked toward the sink. Excuse me, sir, he said quietly. The young man looked at him through the mirror with mild irritation. What? Rick met his eyes calmly. Just a piece of advice. The businessman rolled his eyes. Rick continued anyway. Be kind to the people on your flight. The man snorted. Why would that matter? Rick picked up the fallen paper towel from the floor and dropped it into the trash. Because you never really know who you're sitting next to. The businessman shook his head. Whatever, old man. He walked out of the restroom. Rick returned to the mop bucket. Overhead, the airport speakers crackled to life. Now boarding Atlantic Air Flight 712 to London. Rick paused. For a second, he listened to the destination that had once destroyed his life. Then he dipped the mop back into the water and continued cleaning the floor. Rick Coleman pushed the mop slowly across the restroom floor as the airport announcement faded into the distance. The water in the bucket sloshed quietly. Outside the restroom, travelers rushed toward their gates. Rolling luggage rattled over tile. Boarding calls echoed through the terminal like hooves hitting a shore. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rick moved carefully, methodically. 3 years of heart medication had changed the way his body worked. His back ached if he stood too long. His breathing sometimes felt tight in cold air. His doctor had warned him that the damage to his heart would never fully disappear. But it was still beating. That alone felt like a strange kind of miracle. He leaned the mop against the wall for a moment and wiped his hands on a grey cloth tucked into his belt. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror above the sink. The man looking back was older, thinner. The sharp confidence that once defined Richard Coleman had faded into something quieter. His eyes carried a weight that had not existed before the airplane, before the lawsuits, before the long months of anger and humiliation. But there was something else there now. Clarity. For most of his life, he had believed the world worked a certain way. Power came from money. Respect came from position. The people who mattered sat in the front of the plane while everyone else stayed behind the curtain. It had taken one flight to destroy that illusion. Rick picked up the mop again and continued down the row of sinks. Every few minutes, another traveler entered the restroom. Some washed their hands. Some hurried past without even noticing him. Most never looked directly at the man cleaning the floor beneath their feet. Once that would have angered him. Now he barely noticed. He had spent the first year after the scandal drowning in resentment. The internet never forgot. His name still appeared in search results attached to the video that had exploded across the world. Millions of people had watched him destroy his own life in real time. For months, he blamed everyone else. The airline, the passengers, the reporters, even Marcus Bennett. But anger, as Marcus once said, was very bad for the heart. Eventually, Rick had grown tired of carrying it. The mop slid slowly across the tile again. Outside the restroom door, a group of travelers paused to check the digital screen, listing departures. One of them laughed loudly. Another complained about seat upgrades. The conversation drifted into the restroom through the open doorway. Rick rinsed the mop again and wrung out the water. 3 years earlier, he would have been one of those men, talking loudly about deals, about first-class seats, about power. Now he watched them the way someone watches a distant version of themselves. Not with bitterness, just recognition. A moment later, the same young businessman who had brushed past earlier stepped back into the restroom. He seemed irritated now, scrolling through his phone. Rick stepped aside to give him space. The man washed his hands quickly and glanced up into the mirror. For a second, his eyes landed on Rick. Recognition flickered. Not full recognition. Just the vague sense that he had seen this face somewhere before. But the thought passed quickly. He dried his hands and walked out again without another word. Rick continued cleaning. The airport speaker crackled once more. Final boarding call for Atlantic Air Flight 712 to London. The words echoed through the terminal. Rick paused again. 3 years ago, that same flight number had changed everything. For months he avoided even hearing it. But time had a way of smoothing the sharp edges of memory. Now the sound simply reminded him how strange life could be. Somewhere out there in the world, Marcus Bennett was probably finishing another surgery, saving another life, continuing a career that had never slowed down. Rick had followed the news quietly over the years. The Bennett Foundation had expanded hospitals across 3 continents, new medical programs, new research centers. Thousands of lives changed by a man who had once stood calmly in the aisle of an airplane while being insulted by a stranger. Rick sometimes wondered if Marcus remembered him at all. Probably not. The world Marcus lived in had always been larger than one angry passenger. Rick dipped the mop into the bucket one last time and finished the final section of tile. The restroom floor shone under the fluorescent lights. Clean, orderly. A small job done well. He leaned the mop back into the bucket and straightened slowly. His back cracked softly. Outside the restroom, the terminal remained full of motion. Families heading toward vacations, business travelers chasing deals, people carrying their hopes and frustrations through the same doors. Rick stepped into the hallway and pushed the mop bucket toward the service closet. No one stopped him. No one asked his name. He was simply another worker in a busy airport. But as he passed the window overlooking the runway, he paused for a moment. An aircraft was pulling away from the gate. Its engines roared softly as it began to taxi toward the runway. Another flight to London. Another group of strangers about to share the same cabin for a few hours. Rick watched the plane move slowly across the tarmac. 3 years earlier, he believed wealth made him untouchable. He believed respect could be demanded. He believed power meant sitting in the front while others stayed behind. But life had stripped those illusions away, piece by piece. What remained was something simpler. How a person treats the people around them. The waiter, the janitor, the stranger sitting beside them on a plane. Those small moments decide far more about a life than money ever will. Rick pushed the bucket forward again and disappeared down the hallway to finish his shift. And if this story reminded you how powerful simple kindness can be, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop 3 words in the comments that describe what you felt while watching. Kindness changes everything.